As Jesse mentioned, I co-founded Primitive Spark. This is actually my third digital agency that I founded with some partners. And I've been doing interactive design for over 2 decades. So I've probably made every UX mistake in the book at least once. But my business partner, Catherine, says, make new mistakes. And that's a good goal to have. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So I have some battle stories to share with you about visualizing data. So why should we visualize data? An IDC study about big data says that the amount of data in our universe that we're collecting is going to increase 50 times from 2010 to 2020. Okay? The problem is we're analyzing about 0.5% of that data. And their study goes on to show that if the average Fortune 1000 company could increase what they're analyzing just by a little bit here to 0.55%, the average company in the Fortune 1000 would have $65 million worth of additional revenue. So that study makes it really clear why we need to be visualizing data. Analysis by hand is inefficient and labor intensive. So having visualizations that are automated can be really incredibly valuable. Now, I want to clarify that we're not talking about visualization for art's sake. And don't get me wrong, I love the combination of data and art. It's really cool. This is a neat cross-references of the Bible visualization done by Chris Harrison. But it's not really what we're talking about today. I'm going to be talking about visualizations for action. And what I mean by that is even this humble bar graph that maybe isn't art, but it can help you make decisions with real-world dynamic data. Like, what age group should you target for your next museum exhibit? But there are a lot of challenges for designing something that's living and breathing. Now, you may have heard that statistics can make almost anything believable. And this is an important one that illustrates the fact. Studies show that 96.7% of all sentences that start with studies show are complete bullshit. Let me tell you why this is relevant. Before I was into interactive, I worked for the newspaper. And I did a lot of data visualizations that were for print. And it's a lot easier to make a point when you hand curate something and it's static. You know, I can choose the exact slice of data to make studies show whatever the heck I want. But with the dynamic application, we don't really have that luxury. This needs to work for every possible scenario. It needs to work for different users. A different user is going to have different data. It's going to be different 10 minutes from now. So this is why it's really challenging to design them. So today, here's a little outline of what we're going to discuss today, some strategies for taking on those challenges. I'd like to spend half the time on each of these, and hopefully in the middle we'll do something rowdy to get that digestion going. Let's start at the beginning here. Big picture. The dashboard is a place where dynamic visualizations often show up. So, and I think we all know what the metaphor is, but I was surprised to find out how far back this metaphor goes. With a horse and carriage, a dashboard was originally literally a piece of wood at the front of the carriage to keep mud and other materials off the driver. Now, being this close to the business end of a horse, I think you can imagine what those other materials might be. But this gave me a lot of realization about what a dashboard should do for digital. And that is, we should be protecting users from detail. We're not collecting stuff on a dashboard. We're protecting users from detail by summarizing things that are important. Now, this might be the more familiar metaphor that we're all used to looking at. In a car, a dashboard is a simple set of gauges that provide information that's valuable while you're driving. Now, each one answers a specific kind of question that you have to make decisions as you're driving. Am I going the right speed? Do I need to get gas? Is my engine okay? Do I need to stop the car right now? But one thing about a dashboard in a car is it can't get in the way of your driving. And this is important to apply to digital as well. So in this case, now this is a really cool 70s vintage Cadillac. It's probably owned by some hipster who bought it from my grandfather or something. But notice there's no RPM gauge in this car. Does anybody have an idea why there wouldn't be no tachometer in this car? All right, who said that? You did? Okay. Better. I'm a lousy throw, so there we go. Okay. Yes, it's an automatic. So with an automatic, you're not choosing when the gears change. So you don't really need to know how fast the engine is spinning. Now, if you're in a Ferrari and you're racing around a track or something, that tachometer becomes front and center, and you really need that. That's what you need to get the most power out of your car. And no, this isn't my car, but thanks for asking. This is a little bit above my pay grade. Let's apply these concepts from the metaphor to the application dashboard. And the very first question, as you probably heard from all the other previous speakers, is who is your audience? And this is really important. So what questions are they after? What answers do they need? What decisions do they have to make? What are their key performance indicators? What language is business language is relevant to them in their industry? And what other applications are they familiar with that you can borrow patterns from? These are all good questions to ask in your user interviews. Ask about their business processes and how they might want to use the information that you're designing with. Now, once you have this information and findings gathered, definitely put it into a persona. And Amanda, I had never heard the term proto-persona, but that's why I'm here learning too. But a persona for us is something that we refer to throughout the project. It makes the research become more tangible and easy for the team to refer to. Have them out when you're designing and keep asking yourself, does Megan Butler, the CEO, really find this valuable? Is this answering her pain points? And once you have some wireframes and artifacts to show, take it to someone that this persona is based on and ask them directly. So in your process, the persona should follow you throughout all of your deliverables. And Ms. Butler here is going to follow us through this presentation. And she's a little bit mischievous, so be careful. Now notice she's a CEO, so she's not going to be in this application very much, right? If at all, she'll have somebody pull things for her into PowerPoint or whatever CEO native things are. Her tech savvy is kind of on the lower end of things. So she might be what we call a casual user. And a dashboard for a casual user might look something like Fitbit's dashboard. Simple, intuitive, less technical, less functions available, and requires no training. So this is something about your audience. Are you designing for somebody who's a casual user? Or are you designing somebody that is a power user? Now, a power user's dashboard would look a little bit crazy. And I think Ms. Butler would run screaming from this one. This is the Space Shuttle Endeavour's cockpit. But a power user dashboard might have a lot more functions. There might be shorthand language. There might be stuff for repetitive tasks that you're doing over and over again, and might require a lot of training to be totally efficient on these things. Another question related to your audience: are you planning on doing role-based dashboards? So this is an example of how the dashboard in one project we did changes on different roles. So the worker bee here is concerned with just a few items, but in a little bit more detail. Whereas the queen bee over here sees everything from a very high level. So we thought of these as separate designs. So we actually had different wireframe mockups for these different roles. Another aspect of your audience with relationship dashboards is it going to be personalized, either automatically or by the user? Now this is a dating site for seniors, and Mr. Fly Guy here might have chosen some of the items that are on this dashboard, but others might be automatically assigned him with business logic based on his profile. So know as much as you can about your user and your audience before you get started. And then once you have some answers, you're ready to start thinking about what goes on your dashboard. In software, a good dashboard typically provides three things that I like to call the three S's: status, summary, and starting point. Let's go through these for a minute. Now, status is like the lay of the land. You get something at a glance. You can see an overview. Like in this case, your 8 data centers are online. But ideally, you would highlight things that need your attention in some way. So you can see that some of these things are red, like DC Metro here is not doing so well. So status is really a snapshot of now. And we'll talk about some visualizations that are appropriate for that. Provide a summary on your dashboard. So if your application has 3 main functional areas, you want to summarize each one. And this does a couple of different things. It lets the user decide where they're going to focus their energy next. But it also demonstrates the value of your application. So providing a summary is good. It should be very high level. Now, my presentation is called Visualizations for Action, and starting point is really key in that action part. So a good dashboard should give you decision-making information that you can act on. And these things should have clear calls to action. If you have an alert, you may want to know all about that alert, and then so that you can take action on it. Or you may be able to click a button right on the screen and restart a server or something. This is for VMware. But there might be stuff that happens offline that maybe somebody needs to go and change a filter in the sub-basement. But no matter what it is, if there's a way that you can give people a starting point to take action immediately, by all means give them that information. So even if it's offline, hey, okay, you need to change this filter. Here's Jacob's number in facilities, so have him go down there and do it. Now, I have a real pet peeve about gauges because they take up a lot of space. As a designer, I feel like you can do something more efficient here with the same amount of information. But why do these keep showing up on dashboards? Well, there might be a fourth S going on here, and that is psychology. I can spell real good. Anyway, a lot of the people that use dashboards traditionally are type A personalities, and referring to something that puts them in the driver's seat is a good psychological effect on them, so it can be effective. Now, I told you that I don't drive a Ferrari. I actually drive a Volkswagen, but this is my car dashboard. And just a show of hands, how many people think that my Volkswagen hatchback can actually go 200 miles per hour? Anybody? Maybe if you dropped it out of an airplane. But this is psychology at work. You know, the reason they did this is to help me feel like I'm driving something sporty and special, and maybe choke some more cash out of me when I buy this thing, right? Oh yeah, that's Volkswagen for you. Oh yeah, Volkswagen. There's a J in there. This is a graph that we did for the Winchester Mystery House, and it tracks ghost sightings that people report on the website. Now, this was less about being precise because they didn't really get very many of these submissions on the website, but it's more about being spooky. So we did this kind of vague thing here. So this is a psychological effect here. Next thing you want to do is think about the space that you have to work with. Now, JD mentioned that using the space, finding out about your space when you're going to do one of these experience mapping workshops is important, but it's also important when you're thinking about what real estate you have with your dashboard and also what your user's environment is like. So a good place to start here is going to your persona and prioritizing the top concerns of this person. And you can even rough out the real estate by putting kind of some space, allotting space based on priority here. And then it's a matter of deciding what goes in each part. Now, speaking of boxes, modularity is your friend when you're designing a dashboard. And what I mean by that is having pieces that can be swapped in and out are really helpful because it gives you flexible layouts. If you have customizable dashboards that users can choose things, this can be very helpful. It's also great for role-based dashboards because you're reusing things. Maybe some of the elements are relevant, but others are not, so you can reuse some of those elements. And it also responds well to different devices. So we're getting a lot more dependent on our mobile devices now. So this is becoming increasingly relevant, even though maybe it lags a little bit behind in terms of like business to business type of stuff. Now, your modules can also respond on your dashboard. And here's an example of the same widget that is presented differently depending on how much horizontal real estate is available. So you might see this top thing if you're on a mobile device, and the bottom thing if you're living in this lush 30-inch monitor. But the screen space isn't the only space we need to think about. Now, I think we've all done this. So imagine you're in bed and it's dark and you can't sleep and you decide to check your Instagram or something and you turn on your phone, and what happens? You get a sunburn on your eyeballs, basically, right? Well, if your users are typically in a dark environment, when they view your app, you might want to consider giving them a dark theme. Now, this is a picture from the forthcoming macOS Mojave. And I don't know what took Apple so long to figure this out, but we're finally getting a dark theme for that. Now, the flip side is also true. If your users are in bright sunlight or in bright environments in an office, your dashboard is going to need to have a lot of contrast. So, for example, we worked on a project for farmers that used aerial imagery to do data analysis on fields. And they were using this often on the field with an iPad. So we had to put a lot of contrast in there so they could see what they're doing. This can also be true for your executives that live in the corner office with a lot of windows and stuff. So that's the space. With design, it's always good to be minimal, but minimal is especially important on a dashboard. If we think back to that wooden piece on the front of the horse carriage, everything on your dashboard needs to count. And if you're on the fence about whether something has value, leave it out. When you test with users, you can always ask if something's missing. but also be sure to ask if anything can be removed, because less really is more with the dashboard. It's got to be a starting point. Now, a dashboard is not a report, and I've made this mistake. You might have seen it in previous slides here, but if you have lists, try to keep them to 3 items or less, and maybe think about other ways you could present things more visually. And if you have scrolling or pagination going on your dashboard, that might be a cue that you need to rethink some stuff. Another thing that's not ideal for dashboards is tabular data. So if you have a table, you want to be minimal with the number of columns that you have, and save all that juicy detail for a lower level screen that's dedicated to that one element. Now, how many people here are totally burned out on the term progressive disclosure? I know, it's a bit of a cliche, but the concept is really valuable for dashboards. So reveal things like on tap or on hover instead of showing it all at once. And this way you're not overwhelming your user, but it also has the side benefit of giving the user quick access to the one thing they want to look at. So that could be nice. Now, if you have really complex visuals that have a bunch of layers, like on a detail screen like this one, start with some of the layers off. And this allows users to kind of grow into what's going on here. Because if they look at something crazy like this at the beginning, they might run screaming. But this kind of thing reduces the cognitive load that you have when you first visit something. Another good strategy that you probably have all used for progressive disclosure are tabs and accordions. So this is great for dashboards so that you can kind of compartmentalize and put your most important thing on the first tab or accordion item, and then the other ones expose when the user wants those. You'll also need to think about filters and what filters or controls are going to affect the content on your dashboard. And one of the main filters that affect a lot of dashboards is time. So a dashboard is actually never really truly real time, and it gets more and more expensive the closer you get to real time. But when the seconds matter, it's nice to have a timestamp on your dashboard to find out when this data is coming from, because that can help people make decisions. Now in this case, there's actually a refresh button on here, and I know what you're thinking, a browser has a perfectly good refresh button, but there's cases where you might want to have a smarter refresh that only refreshes certain things, maybe not the UI, Chrome, but just certain data. So that could be a reason for doing stuff like that. Houston, we have a problem. This is a network operations center. This is a place where some of VMware's tools might be used, and you notice the dark theme in place here. Those big screens on the wall are passive displays. So the ones in the foreground, this guy is actually using and interacting with, but the other ones are just for visual reference. So nobody's interacting with them. Those need to refresh themselves. So some ways to do that are to put them on a timer. Some of the tools in VMware allow you to have a sequence of tabs that go through at a certain period and change. They can also just auto refresh if it's a really important view. Maybe it stays up all the time. But you can design a particular chart to auto refresh and get data every few seconds. But you can also reload the entire thing if you need to. Now, remember that slide at the beginning where our data is getting bigger and bigger. So with big data, you might need to plan for times when it takes more than a few seconds to retrieve the data. And this example here shows different states of a calculate button for data that took 6 hours to process. So this is managing the expectations of the user when it's not going to be instant. They need to know it's not broken and when to come back and things like that. Another filter of time might be that your dashboard could be viewed in the past. This project had a pretty elaborate tool that allowed you to choose the time window that everything on your dashboard showed, including starting at a point in the past. So what we did is built this prominent color change to the header, and you see that replay mode button that you can close out to get back to the present day. But this was especially important on this project because the setting there persisted across pages. So you went to the next page and you're still viewing things in the past. So we called it replay and live, and that worked out pretty well. More traditional filters might be at play with your dashboard as well. And so things like topic or tag or keyword might be something that operate on the dashboard content. So you want to think about how that affects each of the different types of widgets you're going to put on the dashboard, and whether it should persist on this page and persist to other pages. So how many people here conduct user testing? Oh, just a couple of you. How many people think we need to do more user testing? I certainly do. I think testing with users is really key. And so to do this as early and often as practical in your project is important, because if you have to change everything in your sketch, in your pencil sketch or whiteboard sketch, it's a lot cheaper than scrapping a bunch of developed, tested code that there were use cases written around and stuff. So it's worth the investment. And if you can convince your boss or your client that it's worth paying for, it's worth making that argument. How many people have heard of POSAS applications? Anybody? Got a couple? Okay. POSAS applications, not to be confused with point of sale, but piece of shit as a service. This is what you get if you don't test with users. One of the first places that we typically test for is at the time when we have done some application mapping. We don't even have wireframes yet, but we can test nomenclature and navigation groupings before you even have your first wireframe. And we'll often show these to users to see if they can find a specific deep level content piece. And also, it's a cool time to test icons, showing people icons before you show them the labels to see if they can actually decode those icons. Now, if you're like us, a lot of these applications examples I've been showing you are super complex. And in these cases, we do a lot of hand sketching at the beginning because even the wireframes take a ton of time to develop. And so this can make the iteration cycle a lot faster to show these to users. And we've even shown sketches to users in the room and changed them on the fly, which can further reduce your iteration time. So that's another good testing point. Now check out this lovely campfire-y looking graphic that we did. I pulled this example because it's really good to test in the real world, and this was a total fail on our part that came up after launch. Now this graph shows the volume of alerts that over time, and this was the actual mock-up. But in real practice, the campfire went to this big block of Velveeta graph. So because the minor alarms vastly outnumbered the critical alarms all of the time, you couldn't really discern a trend line here. So what we ended up doing after launch was changing it so that there were separate axes for the 3 different kinds of level of alert. And it's not as campfire-y, but it does work a little better. But hey, if you combine the campfire graph with the Velveeta graph, you could have like a white trash fondue thing. Yeah. Here's some common points that we typically test with users. And this is after, of course, user interviews, which start at the very beginning of this stuff. But when you're application mapping, you can test nomenclature and your navigation groupings. When you've got screen sketches, you can actually show these and quickly iterate on what your priority and concept is. And look and feel. Now this is important. This is something that we've done a lot of, is where our visual design team is pretty UX focused as well. So they change a lot of things in visual design from the wireframes, which we've already tested. So it's good to test things that changed from your wireframes again there, not in addition to the look and feel. But also, and then the real world test, of course, where you can't plan for every single use case ahead of time. It just doesn't happen. But you keep going and you try. Okay, so we're at the halfway point, and I want to do a quick 2-minute exercise with you if you are willing. And so what we're going to do is a human data visualization here. And so I'd like everybody to stand up if you can and help me out here. And I'm going to take a picture of you and put it on Twitter if that's okay. So I know a lot of you are probably from Burlington. So if you're from Burlington, you are the first people to get to sit down because you're our honored guests. But don't just sit down, slouch down like you just binge watched all of Game of Thrones and ate a large pizza. You came from Burlington today. Yeah, you live here, you work here, you drove here from Burlington. Okay? Now the second group is, if you drove here in 2 hours or less, go ahead and sit down, but don't slouch like the locals here. Okay. Now, if you're still standing, you probably drove here for more than 2 hours, so stay standing. But I want anybody who flew here on an airplane to put your hands in the air. Okay, now give me a second to take a picture. I need to do a panorama, I think. Yeah, you got to do it this way, huh? Okay, thank you very much. You can sit down. That's our human data visualization right now. Okay, so if you raised your hand and you flew here, can you just tell me real quick where you came from? North Carolina? Virginia? Anybody else that flew here? PA? Okay. I think the North Carolina is the winner here. Who came the farthest, huh? Is my geography bad? So you get one of the t-shirts. Okay, so we covered the dashboard here. Let's dig into planning a visualization. Now, you might be putting several small ones on a dashboard, or you might be putting a larger, more detailed one on a subsequent screen. But we're going to go over some strategies for planning out those visualizations next here. First off, know your limitations. And somebody at the last conference I was at said limitations are your friend, and I like that. But they can be your enemy too, if you don't know them going into the thing. So make sure that you know what data is available to you. Ask your development team what technical limitations you have, and ask your client or boss what business considerations you might have, or legal considerations. With data visualization, one of the big limitations comes from your graphing package. So this is Tableau, but you might have used Click or Domo or HighCharts or many of the other ones because it's too much of a pain to code visualizations from scratch. Study the patterns that they have and look at the interaction styles they have. Know how do the filters work. What are your options for theming it? How do drill downs work? And what visualizations do they have out of the box? Now, and then try to align your designs to these patterns, because and you should be able to get non-standard, but you got to know ahead of time what you're getting into, because a lot of this stuff is low-lying fruit if you're using those default patterns. If you're fighting the patterns and somebody has to recode a lot of stuff, then it's going to get a lot more expensive. But play with the examples. So HighCharts has a really cool function where you can explore all the visualizations. They have examples. And in addition to that, you can go in and edit in JS Fiddle. If you know a little bit of JavaScript, or you can get with your front-end developer to fiddle around with it and see what actually you can really do and how far you can push it. And that investment of time is really valuable. It's also important to know the scale of your data or range of your data across as many use cases as you can identify. A good way to start this conversation is to get sample data from your users. Now, when you're mocking up stuff, you want to use realistic looking sample data in your mockups, because especially analytical types get really distracted if the sample data in your mockup doesn't make any sense. They'll get focused on that and forget that we're looking at the design concept. But this also gives you a good idea of what the maximum and minimum possible values might be. And also for labels, like what is the max length of a label you're going to have to deal with. And that's really, really important if you're considering a multi-language application. So, you know, I recently did a project that had a lot of German users, and German is just super long compared to a lot of languages. So that's something you have to plan for, especially for multi-language. Now, this is an extreme example. One of our clients collects millions of data points across thousands of objects, and we needed to show this. So this visualization is really flexible. The status mix shows the proportion of healthy items to unhealthy items. And you can see the 30-day trend on the sidewall here. And the score, the health score, 87%, is also very flexible. It can be used for, their use cases ranged from small to medium-sized businesses that might have a few items in their data center to giant companies that have 40,000 servers. And so these needed to be really flexible, and it is. Understand how often your data needs to change. So how often are you able to retrieve it? Like, I hope that you don't have an application that has 7-year-old data on here. But use that frequency that you have access to data to know what you can do with it and what you expect of the user. Now, this one is a really easy one to overlook, and this has bitten me personally a bunch of times. But what does it look like if there's no data? Consider if there are use cases that you have, and you probably will have, where the data is unavailable for some reason. Either it hasn't been set up, or a connection is down somewhere, or it's still calculating. So in these cases, we need to plan for what it looks like for the user. And it is an opportunity. So, for example, if the user has to take some action to set up their data, this is a great place to put a call to action to, hey, go set up your profile so that you can see this. It works pretty well. Your visualization will have one or more dimensions of the data. Now, I'm not talking about 3D or anything like that. There are different kinds of visuals that show patterns for different numbers of dimensions that you have. And if you're a visual designer like me, you might be saying, what the hell is a dimension? Well, the dimension is just a set of data that you're collecting, an aspect of data. So if we use the simple line chart as an example, each axis here is a dimension. And then there's one line here. So money over time, simple. Now, one thing you might have in your dimensions is aggregation. And aggregation might be if we actually collect daily revenue, let's say, and we need to plot monthly revenue, we need to aggregate those daily numbers into months. And that can be really useful if you want to have a reasonable number of points to plot, or if you're trying to get a bigger picture that might be more useful to your user. Now, if you have aggregation, you might want to consider a drill down for your data. So this example shows private label bar here is a call, and it's really hard to see the call out part of this, but these lighter bars here are a breakout of private label. And so this is a drill down that shows the detail underneath that aggregation. Now, you might have something like this that's a call out on tap or hover, or you might have something that replaces the whole screen and has some sort of navigational means to get back to the previous level. But you might want to consider that sort of interaction if you have it. Now, the magic happens when you combine dimensions in data visualization. So here's some different questions that you can answer. What is the status right now? How does it change over time? How does it break down across categories? And how does it compare to last year or a competitor? Now, remember, you have your persona with you at all times. So figure out what questions that you want to answer for your users. And you can always Google types of visualizations. You'll get plenty of references on what kind of visuals work for different kinds of goals. And of course, there's tons of other types of visualizations outside of these categories. A few of them are relationship mapping. You might see some of these before. And also geospatial. And all of these strategies can be combined, and you can see in this example on the left here, you get a couple of different, you get a snapshot with the pin colors that are showing status, but you also get the relationship on a geographic map here. So those are combining some of these strategies. Let's look at some examples of single dimension visuals. Now, these are some of the things that, wow, that it's hard to see the gauge here, but imagine that there's a gauge background there. Let me see if I can darken this. It doesn't change that monitor, it only changes my laptop. That doesn't do us any good. But if you're going to use single dimension things, these can be really useful for sharing snapshot, so that first S that we talked about. Now, when you have 2 dimensions, then you're starting to get into a couple of different things that takes a series of snapshots to build another picture. And that might be a time series that could show a trend, and that could give you an idea of where something's going in the future based on how it's been moving. Or it could be a distribution of values like we just did with this human visualization. That was a distribution of how far each of you drove or flew or traveled to get here. Now, if you have 3 dimensions or more, these can be very useful for comparison and other more complex analysis. But the more stuff you have in your visualization, the more you're going to have to answer questions for your users. So provide good help content here, and maybe consider reserving some of these 3 or more dimension visuals for power users that would be familiar with these concepts. Now, let's take a minute here. I'd like you to turn to your neighbor for a second and see if you can identify together how many dimensions you see in this diagram. Don't be shy. You got an answer? Okay, the quick show of hands. How many came up with 2 dimensions you see here? How many found 3 dimensions? How many people found 4 dimensions? 4, anybody find more than 4? Okay. Well, the answer is actually 3. So the first dimension is, this is a breakdown by person. So you see each of these boxes has a name in it. So the box itself is one aspect. The next one is the size of the box. So in this case, box size is assets under management. So that means Kathleen and Sally here control a lot of assets, much more than Scott does down here in the corner. And then the third dimension is the color that's applied to this. So the green ones are doing really well, but the red ones are doing poorly in terms of 3-year net return. So there's 3 dimensions going on here. And there's a million ways that you could put more dimensions in here, but some of the visuals, I mean, with layered line graphs, you could have n number of dimensions, and it can get really, really tricky to count them all sometimes. Now, color is crucial to data visualization. So the right use of color can help us see patterns and big picture much faster than we can read words or numbers. So if you took the color out of this particular visual, you're really dealing with an Excel spreadsheet. And so now you can see a pattern here very quickly with the color. You can also draw attention to things that need action or urgent things. And I wonder on this screen where the problems are. So that a good use of color can help with that. What does bad use of color do for us? Putting color in the wrong places can be catastrophic to what you're using. The wrong visual design can really distract the user from what they're trying to look at. And you can see here that this design is super sci-fi, but it's taking away from what I'm supposed to look at because I'm just looking at the background here. Now, I didn't do this atrocity, so I've done plenty of other ones, so don't worry. We found that one thing in visual design that's very helpful when you're designing dashboards, plan to let your visualizations stand out from the page design. Work with your visual team to create a look that doesn't get in the way. Now, for the elements around the visuals here, you might see more neutrals and maybe a little less contrast so that the visuals themselves can be the spokespeople here. So that's a good use of color. Now, I mentioned the layered line graphs here. If you're going to do something like this, you also need to establish a palette of distinguishable colors that you can introduce. And this exercise gets harder and harder the number of colors that you introduce. So one strategy we've used is we came up with 5 colors that are pretty distinguishable. And then we used tints of those colors, like at 50% for the next 5, so that they were distinguishable. But you need to test this color palette for users with color blindness and make sure that they're still distinct to one of these people. This color blindness applies to 10% of the population, so that's a lot of us. If there's 200 people in this room, there's probably 20 people in here that have color blindness, although maybe you might not have been attracted to UX in the first place. But a lot of these people are males, and for whatever problems we have with the Equal Rights Amendment not passing, there are a lot of males in executive positions looking at dashboards. Now, how many people use the Sketch application? Yes. So there's if you haven't downloaded the Stark plugin, it's totally free. But Stark has a great way of testing over, I don't know, like a bunch of different kinds of color perception issues, just right there with the overlay window here. It also has this cool contrast checker that can help with your accessibility parts. How many people use Photoshop? Oh yeah, I'm surprised that more people use Photoshop than Sketch here. Interesting. Well, in Photoshop, they have the two most common types of color blindness built in to the view section of the menu here. So you can see what your colors look like right within the interface. Now, for the most part, people that have color perception issues have spent a lifetime developing skills to work around what their eyes perceive. So in most cases, they adapt perfectly fine, but there's a couple of problem areas that we can really help make that easier for users. And one of them is with status and alert color. Now, if you can introduce some kind of secondary distinction between your icons, like in this case, the shape of these icons changes for the level of alert, that can help people adapt using multiple visual encodings. So here's some other examples that we've done of multiple visual encodings that can help with not rely on color only. So another place where you have trouble is with heat maps. And color blindness is typically from red to green. And that's a trouble spot for colorblind people to perceive that difference. So my business partner, Wendy, came up with a slightly modified palette here on the top that fares a lot better than traditional green and red do. So those are some of the things that we're talking about. Now, as all of us know, there are a zillion things vying for our attention here. And people are often working on the go, using all kinds of mobile apps and devices. And we need to allow our users to get value out of our application with takeout. Now, I've heard a million entrepreneurs wax poetic about the single pane of glass. And I'm starting to hear it less, but it's still there, where all my concerns are on one screen and my users are going to look at it all day, every day, and get everything they need from this screen. Can you make that for me? Well, hell no. 96.7% of these projects fail. Studies show that. It's true. But I say we take our insights on the road. So apps like Roamby, for example, give us good tools for visualizing things on mobile devices. And sending value to places like Discord and Slack, these are great places to send alerts and in-app communication. Now, if you're going to be doing a single pane of glass, it's probably made by your user. And it's probably not just your tool, but across all of the tools they use in their work process. So this is Grafana, which allows you to create custom dashboards. But we need to give our users ways that they can get the data feed from our applications and put it into their sewn together thing. Now, you remember Ms. Butler, find out what channels of communication your users are using and already consuming, and consider infiltrating any and all of these with the value of your application by either sending that insight to them directly or giving them a really good reason to click into your application so that your value is getting used here. Now, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope that you found something valuable here. But I'd like to leave you with one final thought. And we had a lot of rules that we talked about, but let's break the rules together. And I want to emphasize the word together because people are resistant to change. And it's up to you in this room to push the envelope. And working together with people is going to help your breakthrough actually break through. And here's what I mean. Data visualization is very interdisciplinary. It involves left brain people and right brain people coming together. So get your team together, and that includes your client and your user. Do brainstorms early with your front-end developer. Gauge the extra work that you might do for breaking new ground on different types of visualizations that you've never seen before and may not be in the the default graphing package that you use. Know what you're getting into and be prepared to justify it to the client. Share the credit when you can, because this is going to make people want to get on board. And besides, it's more fun when you do it together. I'd like to take a quick minute to thank our sponsors for making this conference possible. So talk to them outside in the lobby if you can and say thank you. But also like to thank Jesse and Eric for organizing this conference and to Crowdproof. So thank you all for your time today, and we're going to take a few questions here, I think.